limited. But the next marathon, he did not finish it. Did he finish it? I think he did not finish it. Because even champions like that, they do also land in their storms. Storms come to everyone, even to institutions and companies, even to companies that, are very renowned. We find that sometimes companies have to be sold to other companies or have to sell themselves off to another company because the glory of the former days is gone. So even institutions do find themselves in a storm. But for today, let us talk about storms that come to persons, individuals, and also families. Now, storms, when they come, they have a way of making strange twists. They don't leave things the same. And they are very creative. There's even one movie that I remember was called A Series of Unfortunate Events. Because a storm, you think you are in the worst of storms. That process, another storm comes. When you are still thinking about it, another thing comes. Storms are strange. They are able to do damage in very creative ways. And the result is that life becomes very difficult. Now, when a storm comes, what follows is a crisis. And all of us, even as we listen very calmly here, we have at one point or other come face to face with a crisis. So a crisis is not something for others. It's something that we have and even maybe are going through right now. Now, storms create different forms of crisis. They create, for instance, a crisis of faith. Now, you asked this morning, I was reflecting and I was wondering, and I was telling myself that one of the things that as a Christian we must learn to do and face is to face the no of God. You pray, you fast, you give, you even ask others to pray for you. You even ask pastors to pray for you. You even send requests to pastors online to pray for you. But still the result you wanted doesn't come. So how do you deal with God that way? How do you deal with God that way? Storms bring a crisis of faith. And that's why sometimes I'm not so harsh on the wife of Job, who saw Job, who knew Job was a faithful man. As God was confirming that Job was a faithful man, the wife could have said, I know, I live with him. But then here comes this righteous man, this honest person, and this storm comes upon his life. And what does the wife of Job say? He tells Job, curse God and die. A crisis of faith. No, God has given us so much, but in terms of goodness, but now he has given us so much in terms of pain. In fact, my solution for you as my husband, please just die. And the easiest way to relieve yourself of this pain is curse God. If you curse God, I'm sure you will die. And because you die, you'll be free from pain. And sometimes I think that could also be a line, not necessarily of faithlessness, but it could be a line of love in a strange way. But you see the crisis of faith. The crisis of faith right there in Job chapter 2, verse 9. In fact, the wife says, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. A crisis of faith coming from a storm. Now, storms create a crisis of self-worth. Who am I? We invest so much in knowing ourselves. We invest so much in our identity. We invest so much, but a storm can totally sweep away your sense of self-worth because it throws things that are key to you out of control. Even people who is rich, a person who is rich, and that is where they put their worth, begins to doubt the value of their wealth. Now, for instance, these times when we are living in, they are sad times, difficult times. And you find that many of our friends who are very endowed, even with resources, but they are in a crisis every time. Because even if when sometimes you get a critical disease, like the diseases that are going on today, you find that even after putting in millions, you find that your beloved still rests. A crisis. You start doubting your own riches because when I expected the millions would work for me, they did not work. You find that the crisis of self-worth is present also because the one who is famous begins to doubt the loyalty of their friends and their fans. You know, one of our very good friends of the church, was Dr. Ezekiel Mutua. I know you know him. He was even called the moral police. He's the one who brought out advertisements that were not friendly, Of course, him and the organization he was working for, he would advertisements that were unfriendly, that looked very, they're not friendly to children. He would bring them down from television. If it is beer, advertisements of beer, you see that they would no longer appear before 9 o'clock. It is after 9 o'clock that you see those advertisements of beer. But when he was asked to retire, when he was terminated, the church was almost silent. Very few people spoke out. You'd think there would have been an uproar, but support coming from the church, but he was terminated. And the church went on as it has always done. No one stood for him. Sometimes storms bring a crisis of self-worth. Now also, storms bring a crisis if you think you're a very intelligent person. You realize you do not know. Because a crisis has a way of bringing a headache that is very unique and not able to be solved by just the regular intelligence that you have. A crisis of self-worth. A storm brings, as we have seen, a crisis of resources. And that's one of the things that we are struggling now, because even as during these COVID times, you find that your beloved is unwell, and the journey is always through to HDU, and then from HDU to ICU, and you do not have the monies that run the bills, the millions. You don't have that. And so we find that in this crisis, also your resources also run out in a way that is very painful. Like the woman who had an issue of blood, and we know that the Bible says that she had used all her money on physicians and doctors and not gotten well, because storms do bring a crisis of resources. Now, storms also bring crisis in relationships. People you had 100% trust in, instantly you get 100% distrust in a storm. Now listen to what David says in Psalms 55, verse 12 to 14. He says, if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If an enemy was raising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God as we walked about among the worshippers. It is you now, my friend, who is totally against me, or who has put a plot against me, because sometimes a storm does bring a crisis of relationships. A very common crisis that a storm brings is a crisis of timelines. When you expected things to happen, they did not happen. There was not even a sign of what you had hoped to happen, and now you're right there because a storm has thrown you into a crisis of timelines. You thought you'd have finished high school by now, but then something happened, and the calendar is the way the minister has told us. You thought that your children would have been done with primary school by now, but a crisis happened and thrust us to where we are paying school fees 4 times in a year. 4 times in a year. Timelines. You thought that you would have a family by now. But the way it has been, it is not yet. And somehow you are thrust into a crisis of timelines. But this also was the crisis of Sarah and Abraham, because they had burst the timelines of bearing children, until she is telling the angel, "You are time-barred." She laughs because of timelines. Is that correct? She laughs because the timelines of angel, I thought you would know timelines. Let me brief you that my body is not able. Let me take you through a bit of biology, My body is not able. And when she says that, she's pointing to a crisis of timelines. Now, when you look at the account in scriptures, when you look at all these things and storms, you realize that there are mostly 3 kinds of storms. 3 kinds. One of those storms is a storm which God has not designed, and God is not invited into that storm. God has nothing to do with its beginning, and also, even when it is in the process of happening, God is not invited. You may ask yourself now, who in the Bible was in that kind of storm? You remember the unrepentant thief? He was in a storm. It was clear he was in a storm. Jesus was right beside him. But he did not call Jesus even when Jesus is right there. It's a storm which God is absent in every way, and he is not even invited. This is a thief. God was not in his thieving ways. Now Jesus is right there, and the thief does not invite Jesus to this storm. So there's a storm where God is not part of the beginning, and God is not even invited in the process. This is a storm whose aim is to steal, kill, and destroy. But then the second kind of storm is a storm where God is invited. You are in the midst of, in every way that I have everything to do with this trouble. I have everything to do with where I am at. I have everything to do. In fact, if God said, passed a judgment on me, I would say, you are correct. Because I have brought myself into this crisis. Things have told me, don't do that. Don't go there. Don't associate. But I've ignored all that, and I have gone ahead to please my own mind, to please my own appetites. And so you find it's a storm that you have brought yourself in, but then in the midst of that storm, you come to your senses and invite God in it. It's a storm which God doesn't have much to the beginning, but he is invited into. Now, that is the storm of the repentant thief. Jesus is right there. This is a thief. One thief does not. In fact, he mocks God a lot. But these other thieves says, honestly, I deserve to be here. I deserve to be dying on the cross. But Jesus, have mercy on me. A storm where God is invited. Now, this thief confessed that he had lived a life of crime, a life of creating crisis for others. Isn't it? He was a crisis manufacturer. If you see him, you know there will be a crisis. But he could also tell that he was guilty and he didn't hide it. And now he calls upon Jesus into this, what we can call a self-made mess. And he asks Jesus, remember me in my storm. And Jesus takes it up from there. And what follows is that he gains pardon and he gains paradise. Now, there's a third storm. Now, this storm is the storm where God is in charge. Actually, God engineers the storm, he makes it, and then he invites you into it. Oh my God. Anaitengeneza temperatures. Make sure they are like above 40 degrees. Am I laughing? I shouldn't. But it's a storm that God has engineered. He is the architect of that storm. He is the one who allows this storm to happen. If we have some lawyers here, there's something they say, force from the beginning, or force ab initio, like from the beginning. So God is in this storm from the very beginning. Now, this storm, just in case you think comes to sinners, this storm can also be made for saints. Now you know that God designed the storm of Sodom and Gomorrah because of the sin of that city. But we also know that God designed the storm of Job because he was righteous. Now notice that. Sodom and Gomorrah, God designed the storm because they are sinful. Now God designs a storm for Job because he's faithful. What kind of life is this? Because you see, Satan is moving around the earth and he finds a faithful man. And they're having a conversation with God. I mean, it was easy for God to help Job by ending the conversation, uko hewani. But he did not. He said, go. Go. A storm that is designed by God from the very beginning. The storm for Sodom and Gomorrah was to destroy sin. But the storm for Job was to prove God's testimony of Job. This also was the storm of Paul. When he had a shipwreck on the way to Rome, God was in it. God was in that storm. God was even giving instructions on how things should be done in the storm. Amazing. Of course, we see Jesus at the cross. Again, we find that he is in that storm, but it's a storm that is even predicted in the Old Testament. It's a fulfillment of the love of God for humanity. A storm. Now, when a storm begins, as we said, you never know when it will end. but you hope for its end. Sometimes you imagine that you will never even recover the smile that you once had. But there's some interesting things, and I pray that this encourages us this day about storms where God is in charge. Now listen carefully. A storm where God is in charge. A storm where God has been invited. There's the loss, now listen carefully. There's the loss of the replaceable, but there is preservation of the irreplaceable. What is replaceable goes. What is not replaceable, God preserves. Now I like how God tells Satan that you can touch everything else in Job's life, but not his soul. Why? Because everything else is replaceable. Praise be to God. It is. And we see later in Job that there is a whole replacement even more wonderful than before. But what is irreplaceable, his soul, is preserved in the storm. So even as you invite God and in your storm, and as you go to a storm that you don't understand, and you think everything is out of control, no. God, Emmanuel, is in that storm, and he's checking what is being destroyed, and he knows what needs not be destroyed. So in the midst of the chaos, there is also a preservation going on. Friends, in such a storm where God is in charge, is that God even speaks in that storm. Because he is in charge, he speaks in it. And we see also, using the example of Job, that he's going through pain and distress, but God talks to him in it. Imagine. I mean, he's listening, he's watching, and then, Job says some things, and then God says, hey, stand like a man. Let me ask you some questions in the storm. A storm where God is in charge, a storm where God is invited, God speaks even in the storm. And even if God comes and asks questions in the storm, the fact that he is speaking in it affirms that he is present in it. And once you know God is present, sometimes that's all you need to know. Friends, when God is in charge of a storm, when you invite God in a storm, God equips you for that storm as well. God may not tell you what manner of storm is coming, but God makes sure that you will make it through. Praise be to God. And finally, God is in a storm, whether he is in it by design, whether he is in it by invitation, God makes sure that that storm launches you to a new level. Praise be to God. God makes sure in his own mechanics that that storm raises you to the next level. Now, when the storm is over, you will definitely not like what you have been through. You may even remember the storm in tears, but you'll appreciate what you have become. You'll appreciate where you have landed.